The radio crackled to life at the exact moment Tommy Fletcher realized he was about to become a traitor. His hand froze on the Morse key, sweat sliding down his palm, despite the freezing Pacific wind that howled through the gap in the radio room's porthole. 300 miles from anywhere that mattered, aboard a rust-bucket merchant vessel that the U.S. Navy had forgotten existed, Tommy stared at the coordinates he'd just intercepted, coordinates that weren't supposed to exist. November 23, 1941. 14 days before a date that would live in infamy, though Tommy Fletcher didn't know that yet. All he knew was the taste of bile in his throat and the impossible string of numbers burning in his vision like an accusation. 3550 Green, 150 moi. The SS Meridian Hope pitched and rolled through swells that seemed determined to shake her rivets loose. She was a tired old girl, this ship, a 8,000-ton cargo hauler built in 1923, her glory days long behind her. Now she carried machine parts, canned food, and rubber from San Francisco to Manila, one of dozens of anonymous vessels keeping the supply lines open to the Philippines. Nobody important, nobody watching. That's what made Tommy Fletcher perfect for what he was about to do, even if he didn't understand it yet. He'd been a deckhand for 3 years, promoted to assistant radio operator 6 months ago when old Jerry Matsuda had taken ill with pneumonia and never recovered. Tommy wasn't supposed to be listening to military frequencies, strictly forbidden for civilian vessels, but the nights were long, the ocean was empty, and the silence could drive a man to madness if he let it. So he listened. Tonight, he wished he hadn't. The signal had come through weak at first, almost lost in the atmospheric static that plagued radio reception this far from land. But Tommy had good ears, trained by years of picking out distant stations through the noise. He'd caught fragments. Japanese naval code, he was almost certain, though his Japanese was limited to the handful of phrases Jerry had taught him before he died. Then the encryption had dropped for just 7 seconds. 7 seconds of clear transmission, probably a mistake by some exhausted radio operator on the other end, who'd forgotten to re-engage the scrambler between message segments. 7 seconds that revealed a fleet that shouldn't exist. Tommy's hands trembled as he scribbled the coordinates onto the pad before him, his pencil nearly tearing through the paper. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, louder than the storm building outside, louder than the groan of the ship's hull, as she climbed another swell. 6 carriers, 23 support vessels, bearing 175 degrees, speed 12 knots. He didn't need to be a naval strategist to understand what that meant. 6 carriers together represented more striking power than most nations possessed in their entire navy, and they were moving south toward the Hawaiian Islands, maintaining radio silence except for this one mistake, this one fragment of transmission that had leaked through the encryption like blood through bandages. The rationale part of Tommy's brain, the part that had kept him alive through 3 years of dangerous ocean crossings, screamed at him to forget what he'd heard, crumple the paper, throw it into the sea, return to monitoring the civilian frequencies, and pretend this night had never happened. But there was another part, quieter but more insistent, that thought about his kid brother Danny, who'd enlisted in the Navy last spring and was stationed at Pearl Harbor. Danny, who wrote letters home full of sunshine and palm trees and Hawaiian girls who smiled at him on the beach. Danny, who had no idea what might be coming. Tommy stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, clattering against the bulkhead. The radio room was barely 8 feet square, crammed with equipment that hummed and buzzed with electrical life. The single overhead light swung with the ship's motion, casting shadows that seemed to accuse him with every pendulum swing. What was he supposed to do? The Meridian Hope had no military radio. She wasn't equipped to send encrypted messages or contact naval vessels directly. Her radio was designed for weather reports, distress signals, and coordinating with port authorities. Nothing more. If Tommy tried to send a warning, it would go out on open civilian frequencies where anyone could hear it, including the Japanese fleet if they were listening. And if he was wrong, if those coordinates meant something else, something innocent, he'd trigger an international incident. Civilian vessels didn't intercept military transmissions. They especially didn't report on the movements of foreign navies. The U.S. wasn't at war with Japan, not yet. Maybe not ever if the diplomats in Washington had their way. Tommy pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw stars. The ship rolled hard to starboard, and he had to catch himself against the transmitter console. Through the porthole, he could see nothing but darkness, the kind of absolute black that only existed in the middle of the ocean, miles from any light but the stars. His father had been a deckhand too before the Great War. Died when Tommy was 7, drowned when his ship went down in a storm off Cape Hatteras. His mother had raised 3 boys alone, cleaning houses in Portland until her hands were raw and her back was bent. She'd begged Tommy not to follow his father to sea, but the ocean was in his blood like salt in water. Danny had followed him in his own way, but Danny had wanted something more: uniform, honor, purpose. The Navy had given him all 3. What would Danny do if their positions were reversed? Tommy knew the answer before he'd finished the thought. Danny would send the warning. Danny believed in duty, in doing the right thing even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. But Danny was 20 years old and still believed the world made sense. Tommy was 26 and knew better. The storm was building outside. He could feel it in the way the ship moved, in the pressure change that made his ears pop. By morning, they'd be fighting through 12-foot swells and rain that hit the deck like bullets. Captain Morrison would have his hands full just keeping them afloat. Nobody would notice if Tommy sent one brief transmission. Nobody would question it until it was too late to matter. His hand moved to the transmitter before his brain had fully committed to the decision. His fingers found the familiar positions on the key, muscle memory taking over where courage failed. He'd composed the message in his head already, stripped down to essentials. Intercepted IJN transmission, possible carrier group, 35-100 Finnvayator, heading 175, civilian vessel SS Meridian Hope. Please advise. Short, factual, deniable, if it came to that. The first letter clicked out into the darkness. Tommy's throat closed up. His finger hesitated over the key. This was the moment. Once he sent this message, there was no taking it back. If he was right, he might save lives, maybe Danny's life. If he was wrong, he'd destroy his own career, possibly face criminal charges for violating communications protocols. And if the Japanese were listening, if they triangulated his position, if they decided a merchant vessel that knew too much was a liability. The Meridian Hope had no weapons, no escort, no way to defend herself against even a single submarine, let alone a battle group. Tommy closed his eyes and thought about Danny's last letter, still tucked in his footlocker. The sunsets here are unreal, Tommy. You got a visit after the war, if there is a war, which everyone says there won't be. I'm learning to surf. Can you imagine? Me, surfing. Mom would die laughing. His finger came down on the key. N, then D. The message flowed out of him like a confession, each letter a small act of treason or heroism. He wouldn't know which until history decided for him. The radio carried his words out into the Pacific darkness, spreading them across hundreds of miles of empty ocean in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. When he finished, Tommy sat back in his chair and waited. The radio hissed and popped with static. The ship groaned. The storm came closer. And somewhere in the darkness, 6 aircraft carriers and 23 support vessels continued their silent approach toward Pearl Harbor, unaware that a 26-year-old deckhand with sweaty palms and his brother's future in his hands had just shouted their secret into the void. Tommy Fletcher had become the voice in the static. Now he had to live with what came next. Nothing. 23 minutes since Tommy had sent the transmission, and the radio had given him nothing but the hiss of empty frequencies and the crackle of atmospheric interference. He'd checked the equipment twice. Connections tight, power steady, antenna functioning. Everything was working exactly as it should, which meant the silence was intentional. Or worse, it meant nobody was listening. Tommy's shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat, despite the cold that seeped through every gap in the radio room's walls. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd tried to steady them by gripping the edge of the desk, but that only made his arms tremble instead. The adrenaline that had carried him through sending the message was burning off now, leaving behind something that felt like poison in his veins. What had he done? The storm hit the Meridian Hope like a fist at 0347 hours. One moment the swells were manageable, the next the ship was climbing walls of water that seemed to reach toward the invisible sky. Rain hammered against the porthole with such violence, Tommy thought the glass might shatter. The overhead light swung in wild arcs, and he had to brace himself against the radio console to keep from being thrown across the room. He should go topside, help secure the deck cargo. That's what deckhands did during storms. They made themselves useful, earned their pay, proved they weren't afraid of weather that could kill them faster than any enemy bullet. But Tommy couldn't make himself leave the radio. Not yet. Not until he knew. The door burst open at 0352. Captain Harold Morrison filled the doorframe like a bear awakened too early from hibernation, 6 feet of weathered muscle, salt and pepper beard dripping with rain, eyes that had seen 40 years of ocean and weren't impressed by anything anymore. He had to shout over the storm, "Fletcher, what the hell are you doing in here? I need every hand on deck." Tommy's mouth opened, but no words came out. How could he explain? How could he tell the captain that he'd just committed what might be an act of espionage or heroism or criminal stupidity? He still wasn't sure which. Morrison's eyes narrowed. He stepped into the radio room and slammed the door behind him, cutting the storm's roar to a muffled howl. Water dripped from his oilskin coat onto the metal floor. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." "What happened?" I sent a transmission, sir." "Well, that's your job." "Weather report? Distress call?" Tommy shook his head. His throat felt like it was closing up. "I intercepted something. Military frequency, Japanese naval code. It broke clear for a few seconds, and I—" Morrison's hand came up fast, cutting him off. The captain's expression had shifted from irritation to something harder, more dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me exactly what you heard." Word for word. So Tommy did. He told him about the coordinates, the carrier group, the heading that pointed straight toward Hawaii. He showed Morrison the paper where he'd written it all down, his handwriting barely legible from how hard his hand had been shaking. The captain stared at the numbers for a long time. The ship pitched hard to port, and neither man moved to steady themselves. Finally, Morrison looked up. "You reported this?" "Yes, sir. Open civilian frequency. I didn't know what else to do." Morrison's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I think so, sir. I think—" "You don't." Morrison crumpled the paper in his fist. "You don't have the first goddamn clue. If that transmission was real, if there really is a Japanese carrier group out there, then you just told them we know about it. Every ship within 500 miles heard your message, Fletcher, including them." The words hit Tommy like cold water. He hadn't considered. "But if I didn't send it," he stammered, "if Danny is in Pearl Harbor and something happens—" "Danny?" Morrison's eyes widened. "Your brother." Jesus Christ, this was personal? "No, I mean, yes, but—" Tommy couldn't organize his thoughts. They scattered like birds every time he tried to catch one. It was the right thing to do. If there's even a chance, the right thing. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what the right thing is going to cost you? Your career, at minimum. Prison time, maybe. They don't take kindly to civilians playing spy games, Fletcher. Doesn't matter if you were right. especially if you were right. The captain moved to the porthole and stared out at the storm. Lightning flickered somewhere in the distance, illuminating waves that looked like mountains. "My father served in the last war," Morrison said quietly, "convoy duty in the Atlantic. Lost half his fleet to U-boats in one crossing. You know what he told me about doing the right thing? He said the right thing gets you killed, just as dead as the wrong thing. Only difference is how you feel about it in the moment before you die." Tommy wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd had no choice, that the weight of those coordinates had been crushing him, but the captain wasn't looking for explanations. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued. "We're going to ride out this storm. We're going to continue to Manila like nothing happened. And you're going to pray to whatever God you believe in that nobody traces that transmission back to this ship. Because if they do, if the Navy comes looking, or worse, if the Japanese come looking, we're all dead. Every man on this vessel." "Sir, I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant, but intention doesn't count for shit when you're drowning." The captain turned and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, rain and spray still dripping from his coat onto the floor. "One more thing, Fletcher. That frequency you've been monitoring, the military one, you shut it off. Now. You don't listen to anything except weather and civilian traffic from here on out. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get topside and help secure the forward cargo. We've got crates shifting, and if we lose our load, this whole conversation becomes moot anyway." Morrison left, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the radio equipment. Tommy sat alone in the swinging light, the captain's words echoing in his head. "We're all dead. Every man on this vessel." He looked down at the radio, at the familiar dials and switches that suddenly felt like the controls of a bomb he'd just armed. His message was out there now, spreading through the ether, impossible to recall. Maybe someone at a Navy listening post had heard it. Maybe they were already scrambling to verify, to investigate, to prepare. Or maybe they'd dismissed it as the paranoid fantasy of a merchant sailor with too much time and not enough sense. Tommy didn't know which option scared him more. He reached for the frequency dial, his hand hovering over it. Morrison had ordered him to shut off the military channels, to stop listening, to go back to being just a deckhand who kept his head down and his mouth shut. But what if there was more? What if the Japanese sent another transmission, another fragment of intelligence that could save lives? What if Danny needed him to keep listening? His hand dropped away from the dial. The ship lurched violently, throwing Tommy against the bulkhead. Something crashed on deck, heavy, metallic, the sound of cargo breaking loose. Men were shouting, their voices barely audible over the storm's fury. Tommy grabbed his oilskin coat from the hook by the door and pulled it on. His fingers fumbled with the buttons. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching himself from a distance, like this was happening to someone else. He took one last look at the radio before leaving. The receiver hissed with static, unchanged, uncaring. It would keep listening whether Tommy was there or not. The electromagnetic waves would keep washing over the antenna, carrying their cargo of secrets and lies, and the radio would drink them all in without judgment. Tommy Fletcher, on the other hand, would have to live with what he'd done. He stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. Rain lashed his face, cold enough to sting. The deck was a treacherous landscape of shifting shadows and spray, the cargo containers groaning against their restraints. He could see other crew members forward, dark shapes moving through the chaos, fighting to secure a load that was trying to tear itself free. Tommy started forward, one hand on the rail, feet searching for purchase on the slick deck. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and momentum. The ocean rose and fell around them like a living thing, hungry and patient. Halfway to the cargo hold, something made him stop. It wasn't a sound. The storm was too loud for that. It was more like a feeling, a prickle at the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the rain running down his collar. The same instinct that had made him a good radio operator, the ability to sense signal beneath noise. Tommy turned and looked back at the radio room. Through the salt-streaked window, he could see the glow of the equipment, still powered, still listening. And for just a moment, maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe it was his imagination, he thought he saw the receiver light flicker, just once, like a heartbeat, like an answer. Then the ship rolled, and he had to grab the rail with both hands to keep from going over the side, and when he looked again the light was steady and unchanged. But the feeling remained. Someone had heard him. Whether that was good news or bad, Tommy Fletcher wouldn't know until it was far too late to matter. Station Chaipo, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, November 24, 1941, 0400 Tuanwaus. Ours Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort didn't sleep anymore. He transcended it. 43 years old, reed-thin, surviving on black coffee and cigarettes. He existed in a permanent state between exhaustion and enlightenment that his colleagues had stopped trying to understand years ago. Some men broke codes. Rochefort became them, crawled inside their logic until Japanese naval cipher looked less like encryption and more like a language he'd always known. The basement of the 14th Naval District Administration building was his cathedral. 14 feet underground, concrete walls 2 feet thick, no windows, no natural light, just the hum of tabulating machines and the scratch of pencils on paper as 24 cryptanalysts worked through mountains of intercepted radio traffic. They called it the dungeon. Rochefort called it home. He was staring at a cigarette burn on his desk, watching smoke curl toward the ventilation grate, when Ensign Miller burst through the door with a transcription sheet trembling in his hands. "Sir, you need to see this. Came through 28 minutes ago on civilian frequency, 500 kilocycles." Rochefort didn't look up. "We don't monitor civilian frequencies, Ensign. That's Coast Guard territory." "I know, sir, but I was running a baseline scan for interference patterns and picked it up by accident." "Sir, it's—" Miller's voice cracked. "It's carrier group coordinates, Japanese carriers, moving south." The cigarette stopped halfway to Rochefort's mouth. He took the sheet from Miller's hand and read it once, then again. Then a third time, his eyes moving faster with each pass, his mind already racing through implications and probabilities and the terrible arithmetic of war. Intercepted IGN transmission. Possible carrier group 35D and 158 degree, heading 175. Civilian vessel SS Meridian Hope. Please advise. Who else has seen this? Just me, sir. I brought it straight to you. Good man. Get me everything. The exact time of transmission, signal strength, any background noise or interference. And find out everything there is to know about this ship, the Meridian Hope. Who's aboard her, where she's headed, what cargo she's carrying. I want her complete manifest and crew roster on my desk in 20 minutes. Yes, sir. Miller hesitated at the door. Sir, do you think it's real? Rochefort finally looked up, and Miller took an involuntary step backward. The lieutenant commander's eyes had that look they got when he was 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room, when he was playing chess with an opponent who didn't know the game had started. Get me that information, Ensign. Miller fled. Rochefort stood and walked to the wall map of the Pacific that dominated the east side of the dungeon. Red pins marked known Japanese naval positions. Blue pins marked American forces. White pins marked merchant vessels and civilian traffic. It was a sparse constellation, the Pacific being far too vast for complete coverage, but patterns emerged if you looked long enough. His finger traced south from the coordinates. The Meridian Hope had reported. 35 degree and 158 degree, middle of nowhere. Nothing but empty ocean, supposedly. But if you extended that line on a bearing of 175 degrees, Pearl Harbor, his hand dropped. For the past 3 weeks, Station Haipo had been tracking an anomaly. Japanese radio traffic had increased dramatically, then suddenly gone almost silent, like a symphony building to crescendo before cutting off mid-note. They'd lost track of several carrier groups. Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, the Akagi, hadn't transmitted anything identifiable in 11 days. Neither had the Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, or Zuikaku. 6 carriers, unaccounted for. Naval intelligence in Washington had theories, training exercises in home waters, radio discipline drills, maintenance periods. Nothing to worry about, they said. Japan was still negotiating in Washington. War wasn't imminent. The carriers were probably sitting in Cure Harbor getting their hulls scraped. But Rochefort had spent 6 years studying Japanese naval communications, 2 years living in Japan, learning the language, understanding the culture. He knew how the Imperial Navy thought, how they moved, how they planned. And what he knew scared him more than anything Washington's optimism could soothe. Radio silence meant something was coming. He walked back to his desk and picked up the telephone. The line to Singpak, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, was always open even at 4 in the morning, especially at 4 in the morning. Duty officer. This is Lieutenant Commander Rochefort at Station Ipoh. I need to speak with Admiral Kimmel immediately. Sir, the Admiral is not to be disturbed unless it's an emergency, I'm aware. This qualifies. Get him on the line. 3 minutes of hold music that sounded like it was being played through a tin can. Then a voice, rough with sleep and irritation. Rochefort, this better be good. Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the entire Pacific Fleet. Nearly 100 ships, thousands of men, the primary American military presence between California and Tokyo. He was 59 years old, career Navy, and had exactly 0 patience for cryptanalysts who woke him before dawn with theories. Sir, we've intercepted a report from a civilian merchant vessel. They claim to have picked up Japanese carrier group coordinates approximately 300 miles north-northwest of Midway, heading south toward the Hawaiian chain. Silence on the line. Rochefort could hear Kimmel breathing, could almost hear the gears turning in the Admiral's head. What vessel? The SS Meridian Hope, sir. 8,000-ton cargo hauler, San Francisco to Manila run. We're pulling her complete file now. And you believe this report is credible? This was the moment. This was where Rochefort's entire career, everything he'd built in the dungeon, every instinct he'd honed over years of living inside enemy communications, this was where it all came down to a single word. Yes, sir, I do. Another silence, longer this time. Based on what, Commander? One transmission from a civilian operator who probably doesn't know a carrier from a canoe? We've had a dozen false sightings in the past month alone. Merchant sailors who see submarines in every shadow, Japanese fleets in every cloud formation. Sir, the coordinates match a gap in our tracking. We've lost contact with 6 IJN carriers. We've been over this, Joe. Kimmel's voice carried a warning edge now. Washington says the carriers are in home waters. The diplomatic channels are still open. Japan isn't going to start a war while their ambassador is shaking hands with Cordell Hull. With respect, sir, that's exactly when they would start a war, while we're looking at the handshake instead of the knife. God damn it, Rochefort. 23 support vessels, Admiral. The Meridian Hope reported 23 support vessels. That's not a training exercise, that's a strike force. The breathing on the other end of the line changed. Kimmel was fully awake now, the fog of sleep burned away by the implications. If you're wrong about this, then I'm wrong, sir. And we've wasted some fuel and flight hours. But if I'm right and we do nothing... He didn't need to finish. They both knew the arithmetic. 6 Japanese carriers could launch over 300 aircraft. Pearl Harbor had 96 ships at anchor, most of them clustered together like targets at a shooting gallery. The Army Air Corps had fighters, but they were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, which made them perfect targets for an air attack. If the Japanese carriers got within striking range before they were detected, it wouldn't be a battle. It would be a slaughter. What do you recommend? Kimmel asked finally. Increase air patrols, sir. Get search planes in the air, extend our reconnaissance radius, and send a destroyer to intercept the Meridian Hope. If their radio operator really did intercept Japanese transmissions, he might have heard more than he included in his report. We need to debrief him personally. That will tip our hand. If the Japanese are monitoring our communications, they already know we might know, sir. The Meridian Hope sent their message on an open channel. Anyone could have heard it. The question isn't whether the Japanese know someone picked up their transmission. The question is whether we're going to act on it. Rochefort could hear papers rustling, furniture creaking. Kimmel was getting up, getting dressed, already moving. "I'm calling a staff meeting for 0600, the Admiral said. "I want you there. Bring everything you have. Intercepts, analysis, traffic patterns, the whole picture. And Rochefort, if this turns out to be some merchant sailor's overactive imagination, you're going to be explaining yourself to a lot of very unhappy people?" "Understood, sir." The line went dead. Rochefort hung up and lit another cigarette, his hands perfectly steady. Around him, the dungeon continued its work, typewriters clacking, machines humming, young cryptanalysts hunched over code sheets, trying to find patterns in chaos. None of them knew yet that everything was about to change, that the war they'd been preparing for, analyzing, predicting, it was already here, already in motion, already bearing down on them at 12 knots through the dark Pacific night. Ensign Miller appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Sir, I have the information on the Meridian Hope. She's a Liberty ship variant, launched 1923, currently carrying machine parts and rubber. Crew of 37. Her radio operator is—" Miller consulted his notes. "Thomas Fletcher, age 26. Promoted to assistant radio operator 6 months ago, after the previous operator died of pneumonia. Family? Parents deceased, 2 brothers, one working construction in Portland, one enlisted in the Navy." Miller looked up. "Sir, the Navy brother is stationed here, at Pearl, Seaman Daniel Fletcher, assigned to the USS Arizona." Rochefort's cigarette stopped halfway to his mouth for the second time that morning. The Arizona. 32,000 tons of battleship, pride of the fleet, currently moored at Ford Island, alongside the rest of Battleship Row. If Japanese dive bombers came screaming out of the sky on a Sunday morning, the Arizona would be target number 1. And Thomas Fletcher, merchant sailor, had just risked everything to send a warning that might save his brother's life. Might. If anyone believed him, if anyone acted in time, if the intelligence was good, if the war came when and where Rochefort's instinct said it would. Too many ifs. Not enough time. "Miller," Rochefort said quietly, "send a message to the Meridian Hope. Tell them to maintain radio silence and continue to their destination. Tell them we received their transmission and are investigating. Should I mention that we're sending a ship to intercept? No. If the Japanese are listening, I don't want them to know we're taking this seriously. Let them think we dismissed it as civilian paranoia." Rochefort crushed his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray. "And Miller? Encrypt the response, maximum security. I don't want anyone reading this except Thomas Fletcher." "Yes, sir." Miller left again, moving with purpose now. Rochefort turned back to his map, to the red and blue pins that represented thousands of lives, American and Japanese, all moving toward a collision point that he could see coming, but couldn't stop. Not alone. Not without proof. Not without someone in authority willing to believe that a deckhand on a rust-bucket merchant vessel had just given them the intelligence coup of the century, or the false alarm that would make them all look like fools. In 14 days, everyone would know which one it was. Rochefort reached for his coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway. Somewhere above him, Hawaii was waking up. Palm trees and sunshine, soldiers and sailors starting another day in paradise, unaware that paradise had an expiration date. And somewhere out in the dark Pacific, Tommy Fletcher was waiting for an answer that might never come, or might come too late, or might come at exactly the right moment to change everything. The radio signal traveled at the speed of light. History moved slower, but it was moving. SS Meridian Hope, Pacific Ocean, November 24th, 1941, 06:23 hours. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised flesh and an ocean that still heaved with residual anger. Tommy Fletcher stood on the forward deck, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the sunrise paint the horizon in shades of amber and blood. He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. After securing the cargo with the rest of the crew, he'd returned to the radio room and waited, his eyes fixed on the receiver, willing it to speak. But it had remained silent, and eventually Captain Morrison had ordered him out, told him to get some air before he went mad, staring at equipment that wasn't going to give him the absolution he was seeking. Morrison was right. The radio wouldn't forgive him. Neither would the Navy, probably. Neither would the 36 other men on the ship if the Japanese decided a merchant vessel that knew too much needed to disappear beneath the waves. Tommy took a sip of the cold coffee and grimaced. His brother Danny would have made a joke about it, something about Navy coffee being worse, about how the Arizona served liquid that could strip paint. Danny, who wrote letters full of sunshine and didn't know that his big brother might have just painted a target on both their backs. Fletcher. Tommy turned. Chief Engineer Frank Kowalski stood behind him, a mountain of a man with hands like mallets and a face that looked like it had been carved from an old tree. Kowalski had been at sea longer than Tommy had been alive, had survived 3 shipwrecks and a typhoon that had killed 17 men. He didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. "Chief, heard you had an interesting night." Kowalski moved to the rail beside him, his weathered hands gripping the salt-encrusted metal. "Captain told me what you did, what you heard." Tommy's stomach dropped. He wasn't supposed to... "Relax, kid. I'm not here to chew you out. Just wanted to say..." Kowalski paused, searching for words. "My son's in the Navy, too. Destroyer escort, somewhere in the Atlantic. I get letters every few weeks if the mail ships make it through. Last one said they're hunting U-boats off Iceland." "Dangerous work." Tommy didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. "Point is," Kowalski continued, "you did what any brother would do, what any decent man would do. You heard something, you reported it. That's not treason, Fletcher. That's conscience. Captain Morrison doesn't see it that way. Captain Morrison's got 37 souls to worry about, and you just made his job a hell of a lot harder, but that doesn't mean you were wrong." Kowalski straightened up, his joints cracking like old wood. "Whatever happens next, you keep your head up, you hear me? You did the right thing." He walked away before Tommy could respond, disappearing into the maze of cargo containers and deck equipment. Tommy turned back to the ocean, Kowalski's words echoing in his head. You did the right thing. But the right thing felt like acid in his gut, felt like waiting for a blow that might never fall or might come at any second. He'd been on ships long enough to know that the sea didn't care about right or wrong. It only cared about what sank and what floated. The question was which category he fell into now. A shout from behind made him spin around. One of the crew was running toward him, waving his arms. "Fletcher, radio room, you've got a message!" Tommy's coffee mug slipped from his hands, shattering on the deck. He was moving before he realized it, running across the salt-slick metal, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Other crew members turned to watch as he sprinted past, but he didn't care about anything except getting to that radio, finding out if someone had heard him, if his message had meant something or had just disappeared into the void like a scream into a storm. The radio room door was open. Captain Morrison stood inside, his face unreadable, holding a transcription sheet. "Sir." Morrison handed him the paper without a word. Tommy's hands shook so badly he could barely read it. The message was short, encrypted in basic naval cipher, the kind merchant vessels were authorized to decode for official communications. It took him 3 tries to work through it, his brain stumbling over letters that seemed to swim on the page. Message received. Investigation underway. Maintain radio silence. Proceed to destination. Well done. Station Hypo. Tommy read it again, then a third time, then looked up at Morrison, his eyes burning. They heard me. They heard you, Morrison confirmed. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his voice had softened. Naval Intelligence Station at Pearl Harbor. They're taking it seriously enough to respond. What does it mean? Investigation underway. Does that mean they believe me? Are they sending ships? Are they... It means they're doing their job, Fletcher. What happens next is out of our hands. Morrison took the paper back, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his coat pocket. And that's probably for the best. We're merchant sailors, not naval officers. We deliver cargo, we survive storms, and we go home. That's the job. But Tommy barely heard him. Relief was flooding through his veins like warm water, washing away the poison of the past 4 hours. Someone had heard. Someone was investigating. Someone at Station Hypo, wherever that was, had read his message and thought it worth acting on. Maybe it was enough. Maybe his brother was safe now. Maybe he hadn't just doomed his crew for nothing. There's more, Morrison said. The message said to maintain radio silence. That means no more transmissions, Fletcher. No more monitoring military frequencies, no more playing spy. We keep our heads down until we reach Manila, unload our cargo, and forget any of this ever happened. Clear? Yes, sir. Good. Morrison moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Fletcher, I'm glad someone was listening. I'm glad you took the risk. But don't expect a medal for it. The Navy doesn't reward civilians who break protocol, even when they're right, especially when they're right. He left, pulling the door shut behind him. Tommy stood alone in the radio room, the overhead light swinging gently with the ship's motion. The receiver sat silent on its shelf, its dials and switches gleaming in the dim light. It looked ordinary now, just equipment, just metal and wire and glass. But Tommy knew better. He knew it was more than that. It was a voice, a connection, a thread that stretched across hundreds of miles of empty ocean to touch lives he would never meet. He thought about the man who'd sent the reply. Station Hypo, whoever they were. Some intelligence officer, probably, buried in a basement somewhere, drowning in intercepts and code sheets, trying to see patterns that others missed. Had he believed Tommy immediately? Or had there been doubt, debate, arguments about whether a civilian report was credible? It didn't matter now. The message was sent, the response received. The machinery of war was in motion, vast and impersonal, and utterly beyond Tommy's ability to influence. All he could do now was wait and hope that whatever happened next, his brother would survive it. Tommy reached out and traced his fingers across the radio's faceplate, a gesture that felt almost like prayer. "Stay safe, Danny," he whispered to the empty room. "Please stay safe." The radio, of course, said nothing. But somewhere, in Hawaii, in Washington, in the planning rooms of admirals and generals, people were moving, deciding, preparing. Tommy's message had lit a fuse. Whether it would prevent an explosion or merely illuminate one was still uncertain. He turned off the overhead light and stepped out onto the deck. The sun was fully up now, burning away the storm's aftermath, turning the ocean into a field of diamonds. The Meridian Hope plowed steadily southward, her engines humming with mechanical indifference, carrying her crew toward Manila and whatever future awaited them there. Tommy made his way to the crew quarters and finally allowed himself to collapse onto his bunk. Exhaustion hit him like a physical weight, pressing him down into the thin mattress. His last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was of his brother, Danny's face, Danny's laugh, Danny's letters full of sunshine and surfing, and the innocent belief that the world made sense. He dreamed of radio signals, of voices calling through static, of messages sent and received and lost in the vast empty spaces between transmitter and receiver. He dreamed of his brother standing on the deck of the Arizona, looking out at the same ocean, breathing the same salt air, alive and whole, and unaware of the storm that was coming. And in Pearl Harbor, in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort stood before a room full of admirals and captains and presented his case. He laid out intercepts and traffic patterns, explained the silence of 6 Japanese carriers, traced the implications of a merchant vessel's report on a map that suddenly looked far more dangerous than it had the day before. Some believed him, some didn't. Some wanted to act immediately, others counseled caution. The meeting lasted 3 hours and resolved nothing, because that's how institutions work, slowly, carefully, paralyzed by the fear of being wrong. But seeds were planted. Doubts were raised. Orders were drafted, though not yet signed. The machine of defense began to turn, grinding through bureaucracy and protocol, trying to accelerate toward a readiness it might not achieve in time. 14 days. That's all they had. 14 days until December 7th, 1941, until a date that would live in infamy. Until the war came crashing down on Pearl Harbor like the storm that had battered the Meridian Hope, except this storm would be made of aircraft and bombs and torpedoes, and when it passed, the ocean would burn, and thousands would die, and the world would change forever. But for now, in this moment, there was still hope, still time. Still a chance that Tommy Fletcher's illegal transmission, his act of conscience or treason or courage, whatever history would call it, might make a difference. The radio signal had been sent, the message received, the answer given. What came next was up to forces far larger than one deckhand on a merchant vessel in the middle of the Pacific. Tommy Fletcher had done his part. Now he could only wait and hope and pray that it would be enough. The sun climbed higher, the Meridian Hope sailed on, and somewhere in the darkness north of Hawaii, 6 aircraft carriers and 23 support vessels continued their silent approach, drawing closer with each passing hour, carrying a cargo that would shatter the peace and ignite a war that would consume the world. But Tommy Fletcher didn't know that yet. For a few more days, he could still hope. And sometimes in war, hope is all you have left. While this story is fiction, it is inspired by real events and real people. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort did command Station Haipuo at Pearl Harbor, and his team of cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to break Japanese naval codes throughout the war. Though they did not receive advance warning of the Pearl Harbor attack in quite this way, Rochefort's intelligence work would prove crucial at the Battle of Midway 6 months later, where his predictions allowed the U.S. Navy to ambush and destroy 4 Japanese carriers, turning the tide of the Pacific War. The USS Arizona was indeed struck during the attack on Pearl Harbor, killing 177 of her crew. She remains at the bottom of Pearl Harbor today, a memorial to those who died that Sunday morning. Stories like Tommy Fletcher's, ordinary people making extraordinary choices in the face of impossible odds, happened throughout the war. This is dedicated to all of them.